Based on Stein et al.'s book about implementing standards-based instruction, she wrote several case studies, and one of them was about Ron Castleman. And Ron Castleman was a 7th grade teacher who was asking his students to use area models to represent how fractions, decimals, and percents are connected. And then usually when you use an area model, it would be a 10 by 10 grid. So you see that if you shade 6, then it'd be 6%. But to challenge them and to make them think about it, it was a 4 by 10 grid. And he wanted them to be able to represent the fraction, decimal, and percent that would be found using only 6 highlighted blocks on a 4 by 10 grid. And so in order to understand that, they had to think about what a percent was and how it looked, and what a fraction was and how it looked. And this is based on NCTM standard for 6th through 8th grade, which says that students don't need to only understand what a number is, but they need to know multiple representations for a number. And so Castleman was successful when he also focused on NCTM's process standards. And NCTM asks that a 6th through 8th grader is able to build mathematical knowledge using problem-solving skills. And so by asking the students to solve this problem, Castleman was leading them towards a higher understanding of the concept, which fell farther from the more basic understanding of just knowing what the algorithm was. If you take the number 6 and you divide it by the number 40, then you would end up with 15% or 0.15 or 15 hundredths of a number. And so in order for teachers to be able to do this more successfully, they need to have a way to assess how well students are processing these standards and how well they're using their problem solving, because those are the ways that teachers are going to be able to assess the amount of cognitive understanding the students have been able to gain from the problem given. When assessing a student for their process standards and you're looking at the NCTM, you're looking at their problem-solving skills, their ability to reason and proof, and their communication, connections, and representation of what you're asking them to do. Another big question you need to ask yourself is how much effort did they put in? Because if you have a student who didn't put in a lot of effort, you really can't assess them for the process because you don't know how much of it they actually understood or how much of it was just behavior that was avoiding the task. So a beginner level student will have made effort, but they don't understand. And you can tell this because they're unable to understand the problem that was given, they don't really think properly about the math, and they don't use the math language or notations to show their work, and there aren't really any connections made between what they're trying to do and what they've been working on in class or studying in math, and they're unable to represent the problem. And in this case, in Ron Castleman's case, you would have a student who wouldn't understand how to start with 6 blocks with a 4 by 10 grid. They would try to figure it out but not really know how to do it because they wouldn't understand the math behind it. And you're looking for, if you keep going down the rubric, for someone who's exceeding the standard. And for someone who's exceeding the standard, they have not only an understanding of the material that's happening, but an advanced understanding. So they're able to connect it to what they're doing, what they've done in the past, and maybe even make further connections to something else. So for example, the student will understand the problem, and they'll be able to connect it to the math. They'll solve the problem, and then they'll be talking about the math behind the problem. So it won't just be oh, I solved it. I figured out that 15% is 6 out of 40. They're going to say, well, I know that 15% is 6 out of 40 because, and then they'll talk about the different skills, and they'll say, but you could also do it by doing, 6 divided by 40, and so they'll be able to demonstrate the full understanding of the problem and how the math works. And they'll be using the specific math terminologies. For example, they might say, so I know I need to do 6 divided by 40, and 6 would be your dividend, and 40 would be your divisor, and then they would be able to set up. So they're using that terminology, they're very specific. And then they're making connections and trying to extend the problem. So they might say, oh, well, if this were a 5 by 10 grid, I know that would be half of a percentage, and so then I could divide the half in 50%, and so this maybe is only 4/10 of a grid, and so they're using that and extending it with what they understand about fractions and percents. and then they can represent it in multiple ways. And so they're able to use the grid in different ways. So when you're looking for the process, you're then able to say, oh, this kid understands it, or this kid tries, but he really doesn't understand the math behind it. And if the student doesn't understand the math behind it, they're not going to be able to apply those extended problem-solving standards and those process standards that you're looking for, and be able to really do math in a way that means that they are connecting to the ideas behind math. And that's what Stein et al. Is trying to help us to understand. When you're doing math, it's not just about the procedure, but it's about making connections with why we do the procedure.
When doing activities like this, you really have to think about your students and who you're dealing with. And so if you think about the Liberty University script, the first one is that social responsibility. Are you aware of the diversity of your learners in your classroom? Do you know what they're coming to you with based on their background knowledge? Have they ever done a 10 by 10 grid with percentage? Have they ever done something that they need to have done in order to actually solve the problem? And if that's not the case, then they need to have had that instruction before you try to give them a task that requires that they actually understand that basic math concept. And then you also want to be able to engage your students, so understanding the student interest level and how they will react to certain things, and do you need to engage or motivate certain students in a certain way, and how can you utilize their strengths in this task. And then how do you differentiate the problem? Maybe the problem is too developed for certain learners. Maybe it needs to be broken down a little bit for some of your struggling learners. And if you are reflective of your practices and you think about what you've done in the past and how it's worked and how your students have engaged in it, then you're going to be more able to create a task that's appropriately suited to the environment. Because you don't want to regress into a more algorithmic approach to the problem just because you can see that your students are struggling with it, and they're legitimately struggling with it because they haven't been trained on what they need to know in order to be able to complete the task. And so you also want to just be professional enough to know that some students, if they're not engaged, it's your responsibility. And so you're going to have to find ways to interact with them and find ways to engage them in the problem, whether that be, giving them a separate time where they're going to come back and then retry the problem because the day that you gave it to them, they were off their normal patterns, or by giving them an opportunity to maybe work with manipulatives if they're the type of person that just needs to move things around and they're really active. But you need to, as a teacher, know your students enough to be able to plan ahead and be able to say, this is who my students is, these are my students, and I've evaluated them, I've learned what they like, I know their interests, I know their abilities, I know their learning styles, I know their levels of learning, I know what they've learned, I know what they haven't learned, and based on all this information that I know, I've created a task that can involve and engage everybody in my classroom, because that is the responsibility of a teacher, to be able to engage everyone in their classroom and not just those select few. And so as a Liberty University teacher, you need to be able to say, have I followed those fruits of the spirits, where I just have a work ethic that's committed to finding how to engage all of my students.